Greetings. This is a Sabbath when I'm speaking, so Shabbat Shalom if you're listening on the Sabbath, or in any case, I'm glad that you are listening. We appreciate your interest in these messages. You know, I'll tell you a story about President Trump visiting Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem. He comes to his desk, to his office, and he notices two phones on the desk, and they seem to be very special. So he says to Netanyahu, "What about those phones on your desk?" Well, one of the phones, he says, is a special phone I use when I want to directly connect to your office, to the Oval Office there in Washington, D.C., and I use this phone, but I don't use it very much because it is an expense to my government, so I'm very careful about using it. So he said, well, okay, I can understand that. But what about that other phone that really looks like gold phone there, that beautiful phone? What do you use it for? So he said, well, sometimes I'm under such pressure that I have to actually give a call to heaven. And so President Trump said, well, if calling the White House is so expensive, how is it possible you can call heaven? And Netanyahu said, this is Jerusalem. It's a local call. Hope you like that story. I thought you'd want me to say something about Jerusalem this week in the light of historic events. By the way, today is the 70th anniversary. December 9th, 1917 is when Jerusalem was surrendered by the Ottoman Turks to the British. And the British had promised a month before to give the Jews a national home, in that area. And it's interesting that on December 11th, when General Allenby of the British walked into Jerusalem, he walked into Jerusalem and entered the city. It was during Hanukkah. Very interesting. This year there ought to be a very interesting Hanukkah over there. As we know, the Vice President will be visiting Israel during Hanukkah this year. And that day, December 9th, 1917, back in 1917, 100 years ago, on the Hebrew calendar, was the 24th day of the 9th month. And that fulfilled the prophecy in Haggai, the 2nd chapter, that I won't have time to deal with today, but maybe I can deal with that another time. I want to go to John 10 and verse 22, and talking about Jesus keeping Hanukkah during his lifetime. In John 10, verse 22, now it was the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah. Now it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem. It was winter. And Jesus walked and often Hanukkah comes out in the winter. This year it'll come out very close to the winter. By the time it's finished, it'll be almost winter. Now it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem. It was winter. And Jonathan walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. So here he is right at the center of the action where Hanukkah is going to be observed. Because obviously the temple, Hanukkah celebrates the rededication of the temple after the Jews had driven out a tyrant who wanted to absolutely destroy their religion, and they rededicated the temple in 164 BC. So the temple is really the center of the action of Hanukkah observance, and that's where he was. But I want to talk today about the connection of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, with Revelation 3. This talk is called Hanukkah and Revelation 3, because John, in writing, wrote at the end of the history of the Bible. His material is the final material in the Bible. And so he looks over the broad overview of biblical history and ties it all together. And one way he does that is in Revelation 2 and 3. He talks about 7 different churches at that time and their characteristics, their strengths and weaknesses. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. He talks about these churches. But these churches are a reflection of the various eras, stages in the history of the church of the Old Covenant. How God dealt with the church of the Old Covenant was in different stages based upon how he governed the church, based upon how the church was governed. I want to go first to the end of the story, to Revelation 3, and the discussion of the church of Laodicea. And this is the 7th church written to here, and it does reflect the 7th stage of of the history of the Old Testament church, which was the rule by the scribes and Pharisees. At this time, the Jews did not have an independent state, but they were a major religious and ethnic group. Especially in the core of the Roman Empire, a significant percentage of people were Jewish, and many people were being influenced by Judaism at the time. And at that time, Herod had developed the Second Temple into a beautiful edifice, one of the great architectural marvels of the ancient world. So, in effect, the Jews had, although they were subject politically, were a very influential people at that time. And in Revelation 3:14, and to the angel of the church of Laodiceans, these things write. Well, actually, I'm not going to have time to just read every verse of these scriptures, but let me just say that the church of Laodicea thought this way. Because you say, I am rich, verse 17, I am rich and increased with goods and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Take a look at Matthew 23 in connection with this passage. In fact, just last evening, one of my daughters, we had a service, a Friday evening service here in this area, and one of my daughters was reading the passages out of Matthew 23, and you'll see it reflects very much the situation here. And finally, because of the sins of that era, the tremendous calamity came upon them, and they were scattered, and many times had to probably come together, not in some beautiful temple, but in small gatherings. And you see here in verse 20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him and he with me. And ultimately, the people were scattered, and many of them would have been in that sort of a condition where they had to meet in small groups in homes rather than in a beautiful edifice such as the temple. So this represents the final stages of the Old Testament church before things dramatically changed spiritually, and we came into the period of the New Testament and the New Testament church. But let's go back to Revelation 2, and here we have the era of Ephesus, and let's go to verse 2 of Revelation 2. So Ephesus represents the church under Moses and Joshua and the elders, that first generation. And it says, I know your works, your labor, your patience, and that you cannot bear those who are evil. Now, through the time of that period, a lot was done to purge the church of evil, as you know. And you have tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. And so we do have pretenders, to the leadership. We have Korah and Dathan and Abiram, who went against Moses and were dealt with, supernaturally. So we have some parallels that if you read on. I want to read to what God says to them, or what is said to them. Verse 4. Nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have lost your first love. You read in the book of Judges what happened. They finally began to lose the memory and the heritage that they had, and began to assimilate to the culture around them. And that's where you get into the Judges period. But he does say this. He says, but this you have, verse 6, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Now, Nicholas in Greek is similar to Balaam in Hebrew. And so, and Balaam, as you know, was there in that first period trying to corrupt the church. And so there were those trying to corrupt the church at Ephesus in the same way that Balaam tried to corrupt Israel, involving them with women who were pagans. And of course, Balaam ultimately was punished, as were the Midianites and so on. So this again is a reflection looking back on Old Testament times. Then I want to jump into the Smyrna church, the church at Smyrna, which was a church which was persecuted, but nothing particularly said against it, but it was persecuted rather severely. And that certainly does parallel with the Judges period. where there was a lot of pressure on the church. At that time, God ruled the church through judges. After the period of Moses and Joshua and the elders, then came the judges period, and a lot of pressure on the church. But it was during that period, because of the corruption of Eli's sons, you can read about that, Eli the high priest, that's evidently some people defected from the religious establishment and established an alternate religion. And this religion ultimately evolved into the Samaritan religion. And you can read the Samaritan tradition, you can study it. The Samaritans believe that their religion goes back to the days of Eli. And interestingly enough, you find here the Samaritans referred to. It says in verse 9, I know your works, tribulation, and poverty, but you are rich in the spiritual sense, poor in the sense of pressure on them and so on, but rich spiritually. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So a negative gathering, a negative synagogue, a negative assembly, but they claim to be Jews, and that was the tradition of the Samaritans. They were a mixed race, Israelite and Gentile, and they lived north of Judea, and they had in effect a counterfeit religion. And through history, at times when it suited their purpose, they claimed kinship with the Jews, and when it suited their purpose, they claimed that they were distinct from the Jews. And so that's one of the meanings. I'm not saying it's the only meaning of this passage, but it is a meaning of this passage, and it points us to Israel under the judges. Now I want to go to Pergamos, and now we have Israel under the united monarchy. We have Saul, David, and Solomon, the united monarchy. Now God was ruling them through a king, and there was warfare going on, of course, during Saul's day and David's day, and warfare is covered here. And then in verse 14, but I have a few things against you, because you have those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, that taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. This is finally what happened to the united monarchy under Solomon. Solomon had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and he got involved in idolatrous activity. He let them get involved in idolatrous activity in the Holy Land, and as a result of his sins, the kingdom was not taken from him, but it did split after him. As it goes on to say, thus you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. So the Nicolaitans are, like, in a sense, descendants spiritually of those who followed Balaam, in the sense that they are trying to corrupt the church and teach them, in effect, license for grace. Instead of grace, forgiveness of sins, the idea of license, that, go ahead and sin, that type of thing. And as I said, John, if you look at the history of the writings of John, he played with words and letters, and he went between Greek and Hebrew. And as I said, Balaam and Nicholas have a similar meaning. Balaam would be, a consumer of the people, Balaam would be a consumer of the people, and Nicholas means victory over the people, overcoming the people. So it's a similar meaning. And so we have this corruption that was there, and that corruption did seep in. That corruption did seep in at the around the time of, particularly at the end of Solomon's reign. Now, I believe that Solomon finally got the point and repented of it, and that's why we have the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, which he wrote towards the end of his life. Now we come to Thyatira. The church at Thyatira is the fourth church on this mail route, as the messengers are supposed to be going, through this mail route. They come to Thyatira. These churches were located in what is today Turkey, Asia Minor, and they were Greek-speaking churches. But as I said, they go back in terms of their characteristics. They go back and mirror the various stages of the church under the Old Testament. And so now we have the divided kingdom. Now God is ruling his people through different administrations, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And here we have those who were righteous, but just a small remnant. And remember that Elijah was thinking, I'm the only one. And God said there's still 7,000. So the Thyatira church is a church which has become very corrupt, but yet there still is a remnant there, and at least that still has basic ethical monotheism. They may have a lot of problems, but at least they still have enough of a core to be considered God's church. And so we see in verse 24, now to you I say, and to the rest in Thyatira, as many as do not have this doctrine, who have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, in other words, they haven't become so corrupt that they no longer are defined as part of the church. Now, I say to you, to the rest of Thyatira, as many as do not have this doctrine, who have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, I will put on you no other burden. In other words, I realize the environment around you pressures you and makes it very difficult for you to do the right things. So since you're holding on to certain basics, okay, fine. That's you are still part of the church. And so then he goes and tells them, but hold fast what you have till I come. By the way, I want to go back to another passage regarding this church in Thyatira. He talks about verse 18, and to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these things says the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and his feet like fine brass. So he describes himself in this way, in a fiery way. And Elijah, as you know, by a fiery chariot was carried into the skies. We also know that a fire came down and consumed his sacrifice in an amazing way, a miraculous way. We also know that martyrdom was a part of the history of this church of Thyatira, rather of the Old Testament equivalent of the divided monarchy church. In the Northern Kingdom, there was a good deal of martyrdom, and also in the Southern Kingdom too. Finally, there was a good deal of actual martyrdom of those who were loyal. Now, there's more I could say, and I hope that what I'm encouraging you to do is dig in and see what parallels you find. And so I'm not going into every detail, but you might yourself, in doing further research, see more of why it is John wrote what he did and how it reflects back on Old Testament history. So that could be a project for you. So now we go to the fifth era. So first he's ruling through Moses and Joshua and the elders, then through the judges, then through the united monarchy, then through the divided monarchy. Now we come to the fifth era. Israel has gone from history, the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom is exiled. They come back, but now a diaspora also exists, but yet there is a southern kingdom, and this is the fifth stage. And now they're ruled by governors who are tax collectors as well. In other words, the Jews had local autonomy. They did have a political entity. They did have their own province of Judea, and they could rule themselves under the Old Covenant. But they were under the control of the Persian Empire, and so they had to send tribute to the Persian Empire, of which they were under their tribute at that time. They were part of that empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, based in what is today Iran. So looking at it from that point of view, we see that if you study the history of that church, you find that it had ups and downs. It had a lot of problems. If you look at the book of Malachi, if you look at the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, you find a lot of problems, which you also see here. But it also mentioned that some of them are pure. Look at verse 5. Let's go to verse 4. You have a few names even in Sardis, who have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. And look at what it says in that period of time about the high priest Joshua in Zechariah 3, how he had filthy garments and he was cleansed and so on. You can take a look at that passage there, and that parallels what I'm reading now. That's in the book of Zechariah, which is in this period. He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. So this is the Sardis period, or the Sardis city, of the congregation of Sardis, which reflects back on that fifth stage of church history, the Medo-Persian period, and the condition of Judah as an autonomous region within the Persian Empire, ruled by governors who were also tax collectors, tribute collectors. And if you read about them, it was of uneven quality. It had its ups and downs spiritually. If you read about those later books in the Old Testament, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Then we go on to the sixth era of the Old Testament, the sixth city, and this is the one I want to focus on. Hanukkah is coming up, and just a few days. And so I have here before me the Hanukkah, or the menorah, the Hanukkah menorah. See, a menorah in the temple had 7 branches, but the Hanukkah menorah, or the Hanukkah, has 9, because there's 8 days of Hanukkah, and there's a servant candle that is used to light the other 8. If I have time, I'd like to expound on that. I'll see how the time goes. But I want to talk about that 6th stage of history of the church. What happens here is that if you go to the prophecies of Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, or if you want to read the historical accounts, you find them in various history books. First Maccabees, which I think is considered by scholars the most reliable, then Second Maccabees, and then the history written by Josephus around the same time as the book of Revelation was written, out of which I'm reading. And we find, you can find the history of this period, and you can find how the temple was defiled by Antiochus, how observance of the Torah was prohibited by him, how the Jews under a priestly family rose in rebellion and drove him out, miraculously the few defeating the many, and then they developed an autonomous Hebrew kingdom, and in effect made Israel of that day, the Jews of that day, a regional power within the Middle East, such as you have the situation now. Because of where Israel is located, God put Israel in the middle of the world, what is called the Mediterranean, the middle of the earth, where Europe, Asia, and Africa come together, because he intended Israel to influence the rest of the world, to go forth to Asia, to Africa, to Europe, and so on. Well, if you're in that kind of a position, you're either going to be a power or a doormat. You're going to be one or the other. And now for a lot of their history, the people in Israel were doormats. You know, for example, in this period between the Testaments, as Egypt and Syria competed, they marched up and down through that land. But under the Maccabees, under the Hasmonean dynasty, these priest kings, Israel became a regional power in that period. And so a small nation became a mighty power. A small group of people in a guerrilla war defeated a mighty empire, liberated their people, brought them back to the old covenant, cleansed their temple, rededicated it, lit the lights of Hanukkah. And from that point on, there was that feast of dedication. Now, I want to mention to you that fire, when controlled, can be a great blessing. Fire, when it is uncontrollable, of course, is a tremendous curse. Please keep in mind those who are dealing with fires out west. I'm speaking to you from Central Florida, a wonderful place to be. But Southern California was a wonderful place for my family and for me for many, many years. And now areas that we're familiar with are burning up, and we certainly are praying for those people out there. Some of my friends were driving away from the fire, and they were only 100 feet away from the flames. Amazing, but they did get out without harm. And as far as I know, their house has been spared. Their house also has not been harmed. So one of them is an actress who, I believe in movies, she's played the part of a victim of crime. Well, in this case, they could have been victims of this fire, but fortunately they were not. So thank God that they were not. And as I said, it's something to be concerned about, obviously, for all of us. But to get back to the account here, they did relight the Hanukkah lights, which were a great blessing. They relit the 7-branch candelabra in the temple that was supposed to be kept burning perpetually, and they kept it going. And it went, of course, on for many, many centuries before the destruction of the Second Temple, to which I've already referred when I began. And as I said, the Hanukkah is not 7 branches; it is 9, because of the holiday celebration. If I have time, I'll get to that. Let's talk a little bit about this Philadelphian congregation and how it parallels the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees. And to the let's look at this. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, write. And by the way, Philadelphia is brotherly love. So these people had love for each other. love for their fellow Jews, love for the law of God. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these things says he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no man shuts, who shuts and no man opens. So he was the power behind the Maccabean victory. And he has the key of David. The Maccabees were not Davidic, and they didn't have right to become kings. They were priests. They were Aaronic, not Davidic. They were my ancestors, Aaronic, not Davidic. But they took upon themselves to be kings temporarily until the Messiah would come. They took upon them a temporary role as kings until the Messiah would come. So they were both kings and priests for a period of time. And let's notice in verse 9, behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. Once again, we have reference to the Samaritans on one level. There's various levels to understand this. Under the Hasmoneans, Israel expanded its power and absorbed other people. And under John Hyrcanus the first, I believe he's John Hyrcanus the first, in 113 BC, he marched up to Samaria and conquered Samaria, destroyed their temple on Mount Gerizim, and in effect enslaved them for a time. And that was a fulfillment of this prophecy in a way. Not a fulfillment of the prophecy, but the prophecy in effect looks back to that period in history. It talks about, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but to lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before you, your feet, and to know that I have loved you. So this, in effect, refers back to that period when this counterfeit religion in the north was for a time stamped out by this Hasmonean dynasty in the south. Are you still with me? And it was the small overcoming the many, and that overcoming the powerful. And that's what he says. He says, you have a little strength, he says. Verse 10, because you have kept my word, my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which will come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. The final calamity that came upon the Judah did not come during this period. This period, in effect, petered out. And eventually, because of civil strife, the Romans took over Judea. It became no longer independent, and the Jews then became more of a religious community under the scribes and Pharisees. And it was under them that we had the final calamity, not during the time of the Hasmoneans. But I want to go back to verse 8. I wanted to go to this earlier. I'll say it now. He says, I know your works. Say, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it, for you have a little strength. And have kept my word and have not denied my name. So the Maccabees were not a mighty army, but yet they were able to defeat this overwhelming force. But they won, and then they became a very powerful force on their own. If you look what he says to them in verse 12, he says, "He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God." And you see that, and he shall go no more out. See, they had to flee Jerusalem under Antiochus. This was a type of the end-time tribulation you find in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And so they had to flee from the temple. The temple was desecrated. But look what he says here. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem. See, Jerusalem was so important at that time, and but yet it was on the outside of Jerusalem where the rebellion occurred. It was out in the boonies. It was in the city of Modi'in where the Maccabees were, that the rebellion came. But then they came back to Jerusalem and they cleansed it. They, as we say nowadays, drained the swamp. They cleared it out. And here he says that I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write on him my new name. So, as I said, we look back when we read these verses, and we see how they reflect the history of the Old Testament in a very brilliant way. And so John is tying it all together. As the Bible is being finished, he's tying it all together. And so, as I said, God ruled the Old Testament church in 7 different ways. We had the government of Moses, Joshua, and the elders. We had the judges. We had the united monarchy, the divided monarchy. We had the governors who were tax collectors. We had the priest kings, the Hasmoneans, who began the celebration of Hanukkah. And then we had the scribes and Pharisees at the end. So this is information that can be very helpful when we study the Bible, and we get the overview, and it helps emphasize the significance of this period in the history of the church, which we celebrate at the time of Hanukkah, when we remember whether or not, if some people are not Jewish, they may not celebrate Hanukkah as such, but they can recognize the importance of the events. And they can recognize that these people were Philadelphians. They had brotherly love, and they had also, the important love of God. The Bible, Jesus said what's important is loving God and then loving your fellow human being. And these people had that characteristic, and they had that zeal, which the priests are supposed to have, which Phinehas had, and which Elijah had, this zeal to preserve God's way of life, and God gave them a miraculous victory. Now I want to take just a little more time and talk about the Hanukkah before me, the menorah. We have the servant candle, which lights the other 8. I look at remember that Hanukkah is the one festival that is of the Jews, that is the major festival of the Jews, that is intertestamental. That is to say, it comes after the Old Testament is finished. It's between the testaments. The events of Hanukkah come between the testaments. It is only mentioned by name directly in the New Testament as far as the actual Holy Scriptures. The Holy Scriptures of the Jews don't mention Hanukkah literally, but the New Testament in Greek mentions Hanukkah in John 10. So let me tell you that I believe that the Hanukkah, the menorah, is actually a symbol of the New Testament. We have 8 candles, and if you look at the New Testament, there are 8 authors specifically mentioned, and only 8, as far as by name of the New Testament books. And all of them, of course, were inspired by Jesus Christ. We have the shamash, the servant candle here, and then the servant candle lights the other candles. So in effect, the inspiration of Jesus Christ, his flame lights the other 8, inspires the other 8 authors of the New Testament books. So I do look at the Hanukkah as a symbol of the New Testament. So I hope that these words will give us a little bit of let's say, a spiritual charge as we do look forward to the new season coming up. The winter season is coming. At the time of a new season, we want to once again rededicate ourselves to the values that we believe and practice. And for those of you who will be celebrating Hanukkah very soon, happy Hanukkah to you, Chag Sameach. And to all of you, all the best to you and yours.